Hi, everybody. The topic of this video is our reading on the culture map by Erin Meyer. This is the introductory chapter called Navigating Cultural Differences and the Wisdom of Mrs. Chen, but it comes from her larger book called The Culture Map, Breaking Through the Invisible Boundaries of Global Business. And even though this is in the context of business, I think that it is so relevant to our work as educators. So for that reason, I wanted to include this reading for you all. So let's take a look. So I want you just to start to think about these essential questions as you find the reading, pull it out, and get started on that chapter. And the first one is, how does culture shape the way we communicate, interpret behavior, and understand others? Okay, how does our culture? Number two, how can our own cultural norms influence what we perceive as quote unquote normal, appropriate, or effective? And number three, how can we recognize and respond to cultural differences without reducing people to stereotypes? And I really think that third question is interesting and important. And I'm hoping to hear more about your thoughts on that as well, as we move into your reflections. So this is the reading, the Meyer reading from 2014. The entire book is available for you for free on the NC State Library through that link if you want to check out other chapters in it. I was just looking at it. And there's a lot of great stuff in terms of how the book explores different dimensions in each chapter. So definitely take a look at that if you're interested in reading more. And so again, this whole book and this chapter in particular is really useful because if you haven't yet had contact with a culture, so let's say, for example, you're teaching and you have students from Africa or from Japan or from South America, and you're not familiar. You've never been there, you've never met somebody from there. For us living in the United States, it is more likely that we have had interactions with people that are Spanish speakers from South America, Central America, and maybe from Asian countries. But are we as used to, for example, interacting with people from Africa or from the Middle East? And so the culture map, what they do is give us these 8 dimensions in which we can analyze culture and thinking about how the cultural patterns that are recognized can be useful in terms of informing us about behaviors. Um, but there is a tension here in terms of we don't want to overgeneralize about members of the cultural group. Because remember that we said that even individuals within a cultural group can be quite different. Remember that they are culture bearers and also culture makers. So all the same time, culture can be changing and can be, um, you know, evolving. I will say, even as I proceeded through this reading and then went and took um, a quiz to kind of assess my where I fall on these dimensions, I did not match up with the U.S. standards. And so you might find that as well, that some of the U.S. standards are out of line with how you interact and how you communicate with others. So, why does culture matter? In this chapter, we learn about silent bow and deaf dulac. And what did we learn from their stories? What was the 2 opening vignettes about? Well, essentially, when someone's behavior doesn't make sense to us, Erin Meyer asks the question, what explanations do we reach for? Do we go towards some kind of a problem, a deficit, or do we go towards, something unique is going on here. Let me dig in and learn more of an asset perspective. Well, most often people go towards the deficit. They think, what's the problem here? There must be a problem with the person's personality, that is causing this breakdown in communication. So we may overlook our interpretation of another person's behavior, that it's shaped by our own cultural lens. So recall the iceberg metaphor, that what we're seeing on top is only a small proportion of all the things going on under the water. And it might be that we don't understand these things underneath the cultural aspects underneath the water that are hidden from us. Remember that culture influences how we perceive, interpret, and respond to the world around us. And for that reason, I'm asking you to unpack your own culture with that critical autoethnographic narrative, the can, so that you can start to think about, what has shaped you in terms of perceiving, interpreting, and responding to the world around you. So we come to find out through Erin's interactions with Silent Bo and Deaf Dulac that neither one of them are actually poor communicators, despite our initial impression, right? Rather, they are interpreting communication through different cultural expectations. So, for example, Silent Bo, she thought that he was going to be helpful in a presentation to a client about what to expect culturally moving to another country. But Bo is waiting for her to give the signal to contribute, to jump in, and she never does that. She doesn't give him enough wait time. She doesn't indicate to him that she's ready for him to talk. So, out of respect, Bo steps back, stays silent, and does not participate in that conversation, much to the dismay of that manager. So, read those two vignettes at the beginning of the article and see what you think as well. So, just like in business, which Erin Myers is focusing on, our work, in a sense, is very much like business as well, because we are working with people and we are expecting results. In a sense, they could be our clients, right? We have to communicate with and work alongside students that are very diverse from us in so many ways, not only linguistically and culturally, but in the sense of many other factors as well, right? And all of these individuals are going to be on the continuum for each of these dimensions, which she outlines 8 of them. So, culture can also influence what the teacher and students expect in a good teacher student relationship, right? They might ask themselves questions about, should students question or challenge their teacher? Is a good student one that speaks up and participates or listens attentively? Should teachers give feedback directly or indirectly? How much authority should teachers have? And what does respect look and sound like? So, according to your own cultural lens, you might have ideas about these questions. But the question is, do your students from those diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds, do they answer these questions in the same way? Or are there different expectations that are at work, perhaps that are not even articulated, that we need to give some air to? So, some questions to ask yourself, and maybe you want to address them in the forum, is how might a teacher's cultural expectations about respect, participation, communication, authority, or family involvement affect the relationship with students or their families whose expectations differ from their own? And this is, very close to reality, right? So the teacher is going to have expectations about what it means for families to be involved with the school, to attend parent-teacher conferences, and to send in supplies, and to sign the field trip forms, and to provide snack, right? Or whatever it might be. And it might be that those families don't have the same expectations. And then how does that teacher respond? So, secondly, what can teachers do when a student's behavior or the parent's behavior doesn't match their expectations rather than immediately interpreting the difference as a problem? So, actively resisting that deficit perspective. And instead of that deficit perspective, seeing it as a problem, what can teachers do instead? So perhaps you have an example you could share from your own teaching or your own background, or think through what you might do in the future as a teacher. So I invite you to figure out your own cultural profile. This is the quiz that I referred to earlier. So you can click on this link in the PowerPoint, and it is by Erin Meyer. And it asks you, oh, this is actually my results because I've taken it already. But it asks you a series of questions and then it produces results like you see here, like you can see in this example. For example, this talks about communication and it looks at where I am. Let's see here. I scored the blue 5 out of 15 questions. The norm for my culture is 0.45 out of 15. So in terms of being high context or low context cultures. So I differed from the typical US, right? I'm more like in the center between high context and low context. Um, so, what does that mean? Well, this is looking at low context cultures. You have communication that's really clear and precise and simple, whereas high context cultures, communication is sophisticated, nuanced, and layered, and reading between the lines is expected. More is left to interpretation. So you can see I'm not totally, away from the US norm, but I am certainly not right on top of it. So see how you score as well for those 8 cultural dimensions, and we'll give you some insights about how you line up with the US cultural norms if you're from the United States or from the country of your origin if it is different. So these are the 8 cultural map scales that Erin Meyer supports, or rather presents, and that is communicating, evaluating, persuading, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, and scheduling. And it would be an interesting exercise for you at this point just to stop and think about the US culture. And can you identify, we already did the communicating one being a low context, but can you identify these others in evaluating? Do we usually provide direct or indirect negative feedback? With persuading, do we often provide the theory, the principle first, or do we provide examples and applications first and then the theory? For leading, do we tend to be more egalitarian, equal, right? Especially with our bosses, or do we tend to favor a hierarchical leadership? Maybe like that, you have to go through your boss to get to the next person, or you have to um, call the boss, by their title rather than their first name. With deciding, does the US culture tend to make decisions consensually with everybody weighing in on a group? Or is it usually a top-down decision making with the CEO or a person at the top of that chain making the decision and everybody else following it, whether they agree with it or not? In terms of trusting, does the US culture base trust on how people do at work, like they're task-based? Or do we tend to put our emphasis on the relationship-based trust, meaning that we spend time together outside of work, developing relationships, and that's what builds trust, not how well or how effective somebody is at an actual job in the workplace. In terms of disagreeing with your peers, would you be confrontational, maybe in a group setting, or avoids confrontation? Does it privately or not at all? Is the US on a linear time scheduling type of environment, or do we have more of a flexible time orientation? And we've done communication. So, yeah, you might just try to jot that down on your own and just think about where does the US fall, or where does your home country fall on each of those dimensions? And this is the same thing, but just with um, the different extremes for those. And then this next example provides some examples from education, which I like. I like this visual. You can come back to that later as you review the slides, because now I want to talk about each one in turn. So let's start with communicating. So we already introduced this briefly, but in a low context country or culture, that would be something like the US, Australia, Canada, Netherlands, or Germany. You tell people what you're going to say during a presentation, then you say it, and then you review what you said. So messages are very explicit, clear, direct, often repeated, simple. Your goal is clarity. In low context culture, students are expected to speak up and ask questions openly. We want our students actively engaging in asking questions. Versus a high context culture, which would be something like Japan, Korea, Indonesia, China, Kenya, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and India. And then less so France, Mexico, Brazil, kind of some of the European and South American countries. Messages are nuanced, layers, and with many subtle signals. So much is communicated instead not through direct words, but through context, tone, silence, shared cultural norms. And students tend to listen more and avoid speaking unless invited in that high context culture. All right, what about evaluating? Okay, find where the US is here on this graph. You can see it's kind of right in the center between direct negative feedback and indirect negative feedback. So actually, we fall kind of right in the middle of this continuum. So if you think about the US, we tend to use perhaps slightly more direct negative feedback, but maybe we couch it in diplomatic language, such as, this presentation needs some work, rather than this presentation fails to meet the standards, right? We might use upgraders in our feedback, words like absolutely, really, totally, completely. Right. So, but maybe less so than the cultures from Russia, Israel, Netherlands, even Germany and France, Norway and Denmark. On the other end of the spectrum, indirect negative feedback is going to be in places like Japan and Thailand and Indonesia, where they tend to use softening, such as maybe we could explore other options. And they incorporate these downgraders like possibly, maybe, perhaps you would like to rethink this. Possibly you could improve your presentation by doing XYZ, right? So the difference between indirect and direct feedback, negative feedback. With persuading, this one's an interesting one. We have application first versus concept first. Finding the US, you can see that we're pretty strongly application first. So, what does that mean? That means when we're giving an argument, we're making a presentation, we oftentimes like to start with examples, evidence, cases, practical applications. We present those applications first, how to use this. And then we maybe go more broad to the theory. So we might have some case studies, we might provide vignettes or examples from our own experience, and then make a statement about the larger meaning. Whereas concept or principle first cultures on the other end of the spectrum, looks like we've got some European countries like Italy, France, and Spain. Um, we have Russia and Germany, Argentina, kind of more in the middle there. But they're going to start with that theory. They're going to begin their argument with the theory and then provide applications and examples afterwards. Okay, what about leading? Okay, this one's tricky. So the US again finds itself a little bit more towards egalitarian than hierarchical, but it is also kind of split in the middle of that. Um, let's begin with Sweden, Israel, and Australia, and the Netherlands. Very egalitarian. Employees often call their boss by their first name, right? There's the ideal distance is very low between a boss and their subordinates. In fact, the best boss is often a facilitator among equals, and communication can skip hierarchical lines. So let's say I needed to get in touch with a person above the department chair. I just go right up to that person and communicate them to them. I don't feel like I need to go through my department chair to the dean, etc., up the chain of command. Now, on the other hand, a hierarchical culture that maybe you've experienced before would include places like Japan, Korea, Nigeria, China, India, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Poland, Peru. And there, the ideal distance is quite high between the boss and a subordinate. So the best boss is a strong director who leads from the front. Status is super important, and communication must follow those set hierarchical lines. Titles and seniority matter, right? I think high school is definitely a good example of a hierarchical community of learners, right? There's everybody's very aware of who's a freshman and who's an upperclassman. All right. How about deciding? How do people make decisions? Well, we have top down, where there's usually one person making a decision, versus consensual decisions made by groups through unanimous agreement. The US here, towards the top down section, tends to be more top down than consensual. A manager may make a quick decision all by themselves, compared to Japan, Sweden, or Netherlands, which are very consensual. Decisions are going to be made collectively and over time. If you think about decision making can take a lot of time when you're looking for consensus among people, especially if they're able to express their ideas clearly or openly. So this is really dependent on the group coming to a agreement. Yeah. So that is very interesting. Okay, in terms of trusting, I also found this one interesting because look where the US is, very close to the end of task-based. The US and people in that culture are going to build trust through people's performance at work, like their performance on tasks. Whereas in countries like Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, China, etc., they're going to build trust through personal connection and relationships. So really different. In the US, it's more important that people do well on tasks related to work, whereas in some other countries, quite a few actually, that getting to know each other outside of work is going to be an important component of the trust building process. Okay, how about disagreeing? Do the US culture, you can see it's here in the center, do they avoid confrontation or do they tend to be confrontational? Well, according to this, it's hard to say. Somewhere in the middle, kind of with UK. In indifference, we have Israel and France, that's in Germany, that is very confrontational. So open disagreement would be acceptable and expected, right? And whereas avoiding confrontation would be countries like Thailand, Japan, and Indonesia, China, Ghana, and Saudi Arabia, where the pressure and desire to preserve group harmony is going to overweigh the desire to confront someone about disagreement. All right, and then we have scheduling, or the last one. And you can think where the US is, we tend to be more towards the linear time. So being on time matters to US culture folks. Same with Japan, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden. On the other hand, it's okay if you're late, if you're working with people from Kenya, India, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Mexico, and China, who tend to have a more flexible orientation. So it would be really interesting for your forum to compare two cultures among a few of the dimensions. For example, for myself, I'm interested in living abroad in Mexico. So I'm going to compare the US and Mexico. But where might you be interested in? Perhaps it's a culture that you know something about, or you want to go and teach there in the future or live there in the future. So you might choose the United States and one of the European countries or an Asian country to compare with the US. Or perhaps you want to compare a South American or Central American country with the United States if you plan to maybe teach here in the US, because we know that immigrant group is the largest in our schools right now, currently. Or do you want to compare the US and a Middle Eastern country in case you're thinking about going to, a Middle Eastern country to teach in the future? So let me just show you briefly. This is what it looks like for the US and Mexico comparison. And you can see that the US and Mexico tend to be on opposite sides of almost every single dimension. I thought that was kind of interesting, given that I love it so much, but it can be quite different from the US in terms of all of their cultural norms, right? And how they approach things with these different 8 dimensions. So just to kind of summarize, while we are using cultural mapping, you can see that it's super helpful in terms of learning about a cultural group and understanding how they might communicate or interact with us ahead of time. It gives us that tool. Yet we still need to just be a little bit careful that, that we're realizing that this helps us not just view things from our own cultural lens, but to step back and take this more nuanced perspective about what might be going on in the background underneath the water, for that iceberg metaphor. So, to connect this to current events, I've been thinking about the cell phone ban in schools. It is in effect in North Carolina, I think, as of last spring semester. And I know that my children are not allowed to have cell phones in school. It's something that I support as a parent. But when it was put into place as of July of 2026, um, it, let's see, students and parents complained that they did not have input on how the policies were designed nor implemented. And they really pushed back on that, asking that, that they wanted to have a role in developing policies and addressing all of these underlying issues. It's not just cell phones, right? Issues around technology, connection, and mental health, well-being. And so my question to you is, how does this decision about cell phone restrictions being put in place demonstrate some of the dimensions of U.S. culture? Well, if you think about it, it was very much a top-down decision. So, right, if we go back to decision making, deciding, the US is kind of in the middle of that, a little bit more towards top down than consensual. In this case, they went all top down. Now, maybe they had some consensus among leaders at the top, um, but they did not gather information from other stakeholders like parents and students. So, in that case, they definitely operated more in a top down decision-making role. Um, all right. And so this just gives you some tools to think about, where would you place decision making about cell phone policies on this continuum? Do you think it should be top down? Do you think it should involve some consensus as well? And who should have a voice, right? Should we include the students, the teachers, the parents, or should it really just be like superintendent of schools or principals? And then how much, right? So lots of questions about making decisions. So finally, I just want to conclude with the famous quote from Mrs. Chen. You have two eyes, two ears, and one mouth. Use them accordingly. And I think that's a good reminder for us that we want to listen and hear. We want to see and listen, rather, observe and listen before speaking. So when we're working with learners, just take a little bit of time to understand them, consider their own cultural lens that they're bringing to the classroom and yours as well, and then look for ways that we can accept and be more explicit about our own communication styles or, cultural dimensions so that it doesn't come across and misunderstood. So thanks, Mrs. Chen, for that quote. Thank you all for being here and for listening to this presentation. Really looking forward to your insights, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.